give a little give a little intro and introduce each of our speakers who will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A after everyone is finished speaking. So I really was very interested in this topic because, especially my background being musicology and Central and Eastern European studies, especially with music during World War II, the topic of censorship is a big one for that area. There's a lot with, censorship of what the Nazi regime was, allowed to be performed versus didn't. And also my area of expertise is in music from the Terezin concentration camp. And there's a very interesting juxtaposition in that in a concentration camp, the prisoners were allowed to perform Jewish composers, but those composers were censored outside of the camp. So there's a lot of interesting different angles with censorship and suppression and how that works in terms of genocidal regimes or with ethnic cleansing. And so I'm really excited for each of our speakers to discuss very different aspects from different parts of the world on suppression and censorship. So our first speaker is Dr. Dennis Klein, who is affiliate faculty at George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution and Professor Emeritus of History at Kean University, where he also directed the university's Jewish Studies program and Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And he served as the founding director of the ADL's Braun Center for Holocaust Studies and its Hidden Child Foundation, as well as editor-in-chief of ADL's Dimensions, a Journal of Holocaust Studies. He's authored quite a few books and is currently working on a book about bystander constructions in late 20th century America. So welcome, Dennis. Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, good. I just had to unmute there. Shall I just go ahead and present, or do you want to introduce other panelists? Just go ahead, right? Okay, very good. All right, well, thank you. Yes, I'm really delighted to be a part of this panel of dealing with, of course, a subject that really demands our attention, unlike many topics that we deal with, important as they might be. The presentation that I'll keep as brief as I possibly can is based on a report that I helped to produce for the Congress of Nations and States. It was a 2-year endeavor. I worked with colleagues from Cuba, Cyprus, Egypt, and India in order to document the ubiquity of speech suppression worldwide. We actually looked fairly closely at 15 regions around the world to begin to evaluate the degree and the gravity of speech suppression. We were also interested, and I'll refer to this in my presentation, in the response to suppression, which I think is something we tend to overlook, but I think it's important to understand that suppression isn't always, and in fact, the case I'm going to make is rarely as successful as is intention. So I do want to refer to both sides of this problem. Before I go into some detail, I just wanted to indicate that I am at the same time editing a volume for the Congress of Nations and States on speech suppression and expression worldwide. And we are just at the beginning of this project, and so we are, and I think just released a call for papers for anyone who might be interested in the subject from any region around the world. And if you are interested in doing so, you can email me and I'll take it from there. My email address, shall I go ahead and Karen and give that email address? Yeah. It's dklein.mail, M-A-I-L, @gmail.com. And I'll try to put that into the chat box after my presentation. Very good. So I want to deal with 3 questions that I think is relevant to the topic at large. The first question, of course, is what is suppression, and generally what is its purpose, and how does it relate to the larger question of genocide or mass atrocity? The second topic, my concern is what, in fact, has been the effect of speech suppression in various regions around the world. I'll make a case for that. And then lastly, I want to take a look at whether speech suppression, in fact, has been successful. Difficult to do this in 10 minutes or 8 minutes, since it varies worldwide, but I'll try to be general about it and be more than happy to take questions at the end of these presentations. So speech suppression, to begin with, we have discovered that its purpose is to achieve hegemony in its regions or power. These are usually initiated. In fact, I think we found that they're always initiated by the state in power that wants to achieve and preserve its authority. And there are various examples of this. We looked at it historically, which I think we should understand that this has been a problem worldwide for centuries. That this that we're encountering for the first time. The Catholic Church, when it was in power in the 16th century, to issue what it called the Roman Index of Prohibited Books. And its aim was to suppress or to mitigate the influence of the Protestant movement. We know that in the United States, there was an endeavor in the 19th century for sure against slavery to limit its access to or expression of opinion in writing, and so they limited the ability of slaves to learn a language, recognizing how powerful that could be. And that in our time, in spite of the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and specifically Article 19, that promoted free expression, we know that there has been quite considerable attempts by the state to censor expression and opinion. In the United States, for example, there have been, as of 2022, over 1,000 local attempts at censorship, especially material that refers to trans characters in their books. So it remains a considerable problem, certainly in this country, in the United States. With regard to the effect of speech suppression, what we have concluded, and of course, all conclusions in research are tentative, but we have come to the conclusion, at least in our report, that the effect of speech suppression has been to, or at least has aimed to, erase culture. So by that, we mean to banish the names or indigenous names of cultures in various regions around the world, their traditions, their beliefs, the musical expression, Karen, to go to your area of work, and even to shame folks for their physical distinctiveness. And this is a considerable movement that has had indeed significant effect, and I don't want to understate that. Whether this is genocide can be a question we might want to debate, but I'm going to use the UN Genocide Convention to define genocide as an attempt to destroy a people. The reason I make that distinction is because Raphael Lemkin, who was significant in building to the UN Convention in 1948 as physical destruction. So I think we should be clear about our definition of what genocide might mean. If we adopt Raphael Lemkin's opinion that it is cultural and not necessarily physical, then I would say that speech suppression has or at least attempts to achieve the erasure of culture. And we can therefore, at least with his definition of genocide, we might agree that there has been an attempt at cultural genocide. There has been in this regard a record of self-censorship. That is to say, without waiting for the state to censor or to punish those who have violated the state's policies, there has been a considerable endeavor at self-censorship. But as I want to end this brief presentation, there is, and I think is important to recognize, though suppression has been considerable and its attempts have been more or less effective, we know that those who are targeted can nonetheless find other ways to express themselves, usually secretly, or among their own people. So that suppression doesn't necessarily lead to complete erasure. As I said before, the state aims at doing so, but doesn't often succeed. And so I want to end with some examples of how speech suppression has actually inspired a response, or we might call this a resistance, and even a cultural reaffirmation. So success for suppression or cultural genocide is limited by evidence that there has been a considerable response to suppression, and that I'll even go so far as to suggest that suppression inspires resistance. Examples of this, and there are several that we have documented in our report, but we know that in response to colonization worldwide, that especially in the 40s, 50s, and thereafter, decolonization efforts have been strong. There have been important studies of these questions. There have been endeavors to affirm cultural expression. The Wretched of the Earth may be the most famous example of that, by Frantz Fanon, published in 1961, that advocated for liberation. We know that there have been efforts in Australia to ban and confiscate books by those they consider to be in competition with them for power. It is known otherwise as the stolen generations, but there has been a very considerable opposition that has led to steps towards reconciliation, and how that works out, we are continuing to follow. In South Africa, a subject that we are alerted to at the present moment, that even though there's been a resurgence of white authority, that has actually intensified Black literature. In China, communist rule versus civil society still allowed for digital broadcasts in that part of the world that some believe are the seeds of national renewal. So I will leave it there and be more than willing to take questions at the end of this panel discussion.
Thank you, Dennis, for that I know that was the tip of the iceberg, but a wonderful summary of the work you did with CSN. So our next speaker is Auring Shawes, who is the founder of KG Lobby Center, and she's been instrumental in raising awareness about the plight of the Kurdish people and advocating for their rights. Though, as KGB Lobby Center, they have tirelessly fought for the acknowledgement of the atrocities committed against the Kurdish people and have worked to ensure that their history and suffering are not forgotten. And Auring has specifically worked with women organizations, specifically Kurdish women and refugees. And she's also a member of the Convening Council of the Congress of Nations and States. So welcome, Auring.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you all to be here. Right, I have a lot of text, so I'm going to start straight away. As a member of the Convening Council of CNS and founder of KG Lobby Center, I have dedicated much of my career, as Karen said, to expose the atrocities committed against the Kurdish people. Obviously, this experience of silencing and censorship is not just a matter of being unheard. It's a deliberate erasure of history, culture, and identity of any nation. Now, for decades, the Kurdish struggle has been suppressed not only through violence, but also through political and media censorship, unfortunately, and due to the international indifference and the criminalization of dissent. As a Kurd, I've seen firsthand how political power systematically suppressed any effort to document the ongoing genocide against the Kurdish people. Kurdish voices are often marginalized, dismissed, or outright ignored in discussions of international justice, security, and human rights. This isn't just a case of inaction, though. It's an active silencing of their narratives, whether through state-controlled media, disinformation campaigns, or geopolitical maneuvering designed to silence advocates and survivors and the Kurdish people. Despite the clear evidence of the state-sponsored genocide, even if we only take the era of Saddam Hussein, who committed multiple genocide, and they did admit that it was a genocide, starting from genocide against the Failis to the Barzanis, the Anfal campaign, the chemical weapon attacks against Halabja and Badinan, destruction of Kurdish villages, and ongoing displacement. Kurdish survivors and activists often find themselves isolated, ignored, or even criminalized for speaking out about these genocides committed by former Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein. But the international community's reluctance to address these crimes has been a form of silencing by itself, allowing these violations to continue unchecked. For limited access to international platforms to repression of Kurdish people. One example is that the Kurdish people face daily is getting their wages. Like something very simple. When you work, you get paid. Their means of living is either cut or not paid by central Iraqi government. This act of silencing is systematic. It happens right now. It prevents the global public from learning the truth because we are so censored. Our problems are not coming in. Our problems are the people do not know outside Kurdistan what is really going on. The geopolitical silencing of Kurdish voices and how it was allowed the continuance of genocide, the geopolitical silencing of Kurdish voices has been one of the most indices mechanisms that have allowed the continuation of genocide and human rights violations in Kurdistan. The strategic erasure, if you can say so, of the Kurdish narrative and the dismissal of their struggle by the both regional and global powers that have directly contributed to the lack of accountability for the atrocities committed against them. If we only take the genocide under Saddam Hussein, as I mentioned before, genocide against the Failis, the Barzanis, the Anfal campaign, chemical attacks in the 80s, late 80s, and the present-day repression under authoritarian regimes, the Kurdish people have long been subjected to violence. However, the silencing of their voices at both the national and the international level has been a critical factor in the continuation of this genocide violence. So literally, it has played a tremendous role in it. On the global stage, the silencing of Kurdish voices has often been compounded by the inaction and complicity of the international actors, including powerful states and multinational organizations, unfortunately. The geopolitical interest of countries take precedence over the human rights of Kurdish people. I'll give you an example in that. We had a referendum for independence in 2017. The outcome of the referendum was 92.73% of Kurdish people voted for independence. And here's the other part. The reaction, the Iraqi government rejected the voting, calling it unconstitutional and took military action. On the other hand, if we go to the international arena, Turkey and Iran oppressed, fearing separatist movements within their own Kurdish population. And then we go a bit further to the US and the EU expressed their concern, urging dialogue within unified Iraq. And then you had the UN. UN declined the endorsement of the referendum, emphasizing Iraq's territorial integrity. So as you see, on the international level, all those all those silencing and putting the Kurdish people in a different perspective when it comes to their rights, despite the strong local support, global pressure forced the Kurds to suspend their independence push. This is one of the most obvious proof of censorship and silencing of a nation that needs independence. The selective diplomacy reinforces a culture of impunity, where Kurdish voices calling for justice are drowned out by political and military alliances that protect the perpetrators of violence. Another key aspect of geopolitical silencing is the role of alliances and treaties that ignore Kurdish suffering in favor of maintaining broader regional stability. In many cases, the Kurdish cause has been strategically sidelined for the sake of the alliance between powerful nations. But the strategic neglect of Kurdish communities, if I may call it so, allows genocidal policies to continue unchecked because the Kurdish struggle remains compartmentalized into geopolitical gains rather than being treated as a legitimate human rights issue. The Kurdish people are, therefore, caught in the ceasefire of regional power struggle, with their voices and demands for justice systematically excluded, totally excluded from the diplomatic discourse. Further, the failure, unfortunately, I have to call it a failure of acknowledging the genocide against the Kurdish people in both historical and contemporary contexts creates a dangerous precedent. It suggests that marginalized groups, especially those without powerful geopolitical backing, will be forgotten, their suffering ignored, and their voices silenced indefinitely. If I may just go into the conclusion, the geopolitical silencing and censorship of any nation, but I will talk about the Kurdish nation and the Kurdish right and voices in a form of violence. It's a form of violence itself, one that enables the continuation of genocide and human rights violations. It's only by breaking this silence, by amplifying Kurdish voices, recognizing the historical and ongoing struggle, and holding perpetrators accountable, that we can hope to stop the cycle of violence in the world that have devastated the Kurdish people for generations. It is time for the international community, and I think it's also our duty to push the international community to prioritize justice over geopolitical alliances and allow one of the indigenous groups that we are, Kurdish people in this right now, both in the halls of diplomacy and in the hearts of the global public. This is just not a call for recognition, but for justice and a demand actually for the international community to break its silence and address atrocities that are committed against human beings, against Kurdish people. Only through amplifying these silenced voices can we hope to achieve a justice accountable and lasting peace for the Kurdish people. Mind you, this censorship and exclusion of a nation doesn't only go for Kurdish people. It's also for many other indigenous groups, as we know. But, let me just stop here. Hope if you have any questions, I'm going to be here the 30 minutes. So, Karen?
Thank you, Ari. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Eva Divkovic, could not make it today. So we are going to move on to Dr. Vera P. Estrada Burrows, who recently received her PhD in Iberian and Latin American literatures and cultures from the University of Texas at Austin. Congratulations, Vera.
Thank you.
Her research focuses on authoritarianism, racial violence, and the rhetoric of genocide in Central America, with an emphasis on Guatemala's armed conflict. She's taught Spanish language and Latin American cultural studies at the University of Texas at Austin and St. Edward's University. And her current book project is expanding on her dissertation, Genocidal Masculinities, which examines political speech and historical silences. So thank you. Go ahead, Vera.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I'm going to, sharing is not turned on. So I need to request sharing for this webinar. So it's a remnant of the pandemic. If you don't have I have to have a slide deck.
Yes. Hold on a second.
right, here we go. Okay,
go.
so you should be able to see, no, slideshow. Do you see that? Yellow,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
so the title of my presentation, Whispers of Genocide, State Rhetoric and Strategic Censorship in Guatemala's Diario de Centroamérica. And it is, well, good morning to everyone, and thank you for being here. Today, I'll focus on a small but powerful corner of the official press, a column called Marginal, published on the front page of Diario de Centroamérica, which was the Guatemalan government official newspaper since 1889. It is still the official newspaper. They publish it, and obviously they provide the content. And we often talk about censorship in terms of silencing. But I want to ask, what if the most effective censorship doesn't suppress speech, but instead shapes what gets said and how it is said? So for context, on March 23rd, 1982, General Efraín Ríos Montt seized power in a military coup and launched a brutal scorched earth campaign that targeted Maya Ixil and other indigenous populations in Guatemala. That campaign is now widely recognized as genocide according to the Commission of Historical Clarification, one of Guatemala's two truth commissions. Tens of thousands of indigenous peoples were massacred, and over 66,000 people were disappeared and have yet to, and will never appear, have yet to appear. At the same time, Ríos Montt's government tightened control over public discourse. The press was unable to talk about the violence or report anything on it. This was according to the Decree Law 4682, which suspended key constitutional rights, including freedom of expression. But beyond legal repression, the regime actively curated its image through the state media. Diario de Centroamérica, the official gazette, didn't just print decrees, however. On its front page, it published a recurring unsigned column titled Marginal, a brief editorial reflection that appears several times a week. These columns are ideological artifacts. They are short, persuasive, and strategic. I argued that they function as microsermons of genocidal legitimacy. So I analyzed 9 Marginal columns published between April through November 1982, and my aim was not only to examine what they say, but how they said it. The core research question driving my analysis is how the Ríos Montt regime used these columns to morally justify genocide. Now we have to remember that Ríos Montt, he was himself a evangelical Pentecostal. He wasn't a pastor, but he stylized himself as such during his weekly official sermons, if you will, on that he broadcast every Sunday night, and it was broadcast through everybody. Everybody had to broadcast. Every channel had to broadcast his sermons to the people, and so he stylized himself as an evangelical pastor, even though he was the president. He called himself the president of the republic, but obviously he was not. He was the dictator. Anyway, I put the columns through a framework of discourse analysis informed by Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's concept of formulas of erasure, Judith Butler's work on the framing of war, and Akil Membe's notion of necropolitics. Oh no, he won't do it. Okay, so let me switch over to slide 4. Okay, so there, across the 9 columns, I identified 3 recurring discursive strategies. The first one was dehumanization and moral panic. The second was sanctification of state violence. And the third was obedient sacrifice as civic duty. Each theme builds on a moral universe in which genocide is not only necessary, but also righteous. So for example, under the dehumanization column, we see that on one column, the government, or we're gonna assume that the government wrote these columns, right? Because it was in the state, the official newspaper. But he called them hienas humanas, human hyenas. He went on to say that the guerrillas are mentally ill. Anybody who would even be remotely be against the army or against the government for any reason was mentally ill. And never mind that it was part of the indigenous movement that was trying to reacquire lands that were theirs for many centuries, and they were taken away, and they had nothing left after the 20th century. So another way is that another discursive pattern was the sanctification of violence. And he, or the column, commented on the Shield Triangle's rural defense when they align with the army, which was not very often, but it's a commentary on if you did align with the army, if you did not resist, then you were rural. Also, another thing that they mention is that the army brings order and dignity. And so it was they didn't necessarily call it a necessary evil, but they did call it a necessity. And of course, obedient sacrifice talks about the devotion, devoción a la patria, the devotion to the motherland or fatherland, depending on what your take is. And economic obedience was a virtue. Again, submitting to the government, submitting to the army was a virtue, and it was a desirable virtue for anybody who was a patriot, who was patriotic. Okay. So columns like Son Asesinos, No Políticos, or They're Assassins, Not Politicians, which was published in April 19th, and Terrorismo, which was published in July 29th of the same year, these columns strip political meaning from the guerrilla insurgency. The enemy is not a citizen or political actor, but a coward, a degenerate, a repugnant hyena. In one column, the author writes, only the mentally ill could support the criminal acts of these stateless traitors. This language paves the way for violence that feels not only permissible, but desirable. Hence, Rios Montt is often quoted as saying that the house must be cleaned, which rhetorically authorizes ethnic cleansing. Here I draw from Butler's analysis in Frames of War. When a life is framed as unbelievable, its destruction becomes not only tolerable, but desirable. Okay. Other columns focus not on the army, but on the heroism of the military. Dos Fuegos, or Between Two Fires, published on April 26th, praises communities like the Shield Triangle for their rural action in supporting the army. Of course, this is the same region where the state carried out over 70 documented massacres. La Guerra, or The War, which was published on May 21st, describes military action as a painful but dignified response to foreign influenced chaos. Here is where we see that the army was necessary to bring order to a chaotic situation. Here, violence becomes a rite also of purification. This aligns with Mendes' theory of necropolitics. The power to decide who lives and who must die becomes sacred, and it becomes a sacred act and a duty. Okay, and obviously they use euphemisms for pacification, pacificación, to pacify, valores humanos, medidas de excepción. These were euphemisms that they use, medidas de excepción, measures of exception. Human values and pacification. They also use the strategy of omission to mention, there was no mention of violence or indigenous victims. In fact, indigenous victims were not mentioned at all. Inversion were the perpetrators as saviors, victims as traitors, and the moralizing language was the fourth strategy, which was just the suffering framed as a patriotic duty, which means, if you're suffering is a necessity, but you're doing it for the sake of the motherland, for the sake of the nation. Okay, and so finally, some columns shift the focus to economic and moral responsibility. In Las Prioridades, so the priorities, which was one of the last columns published on October 18th, and Crisis de Valores published on April 14th, the blame for poverty and disorder is placed on the citizens themselves. You have brought this upon yourselves. If you submitted to the government sooner, none of this would have happened and you would be much better off. Phrases like devoción a la patria, or devotion to the motherland, sacrifice for national recovery, elevate obedience into a virtue. And these texts mask state repression by reframing it as a moral development. Here, Trujillo's idea of erasure is also useful. History isn't just silenced. It is overwritten by a dominant moral narrative. And so why does this matter? Well, these columns never mention genocide. They never mention indigenous people as anything else but peasants in the countryside, as campesinos. But their silences are engineered. They use euphemism, inversion, and repetition to construct a framework where terror is rational and moral. This isn't just propaganda, it's also pedagogy. The state teaches its citizens how to interpret violence. We have to remember that for citizens to learn anything about the ongoing violence at the time, they had to go to the state newspaper because everybody else had a gag order. They were silent on it. So this was the government's way of not only grabbing the narrative, but also controlling the only narrative that was available. And so this is why also in 1983, when Rigoberta's Menchú book came out on the ongoing genocide, many people in Guatemala were in disbelief. What is she talking about? Why have I not heard about this? And it's because the government had taught them exactly, what they wanted. That there was no violence, or that what little violence there was brought on by the victims themselves. They brought this on themselves, and it was the guerrillas who are communists, who are a threat to our way of life. And so it was, again, violence was a necessity as the government scripted. And this also reminds us that censorship is not just the suppression of speech. It's the production of sanctioned speech. It's not just what gets erased, but what gets amplified. So to close, I want to leave you with this. The Guatemalan genocide was not only waged with bullets, it was waged with language. The marginal columns were not marginal at all. They were central to the moral and ideological scaffolding of state violence. And in the end, that is why so many people now who are still fans of Ríos Montt, who passed away in 2018, they're still fans of him. They still remember this message. And that's why genocide is still even a question. It's not a statement in Guatemala. Many people still question whether there really was a genocide. And this is one of the consequences of the state controlling the narrative at the time. Thank you so much for your time. And I will hand over back the baton to you, Karen, as soon as I am able. Why am I not able? Oh, because I'm okay.
There we go. So, well, thank you, Vera, and thank you all for these incredible presentations and for this sort of very global view of censorship and suppression. And I think one of the things in listening to you all that stood out to me was this idea of how erasing a culture erases a people. I mean, obviously, with my background in the performing arts, that's the one thing that's really going to stand out to me. But I think that is always that is a discussion that happens quite frequently. This idea of cultural genocide as ethnic cleansing, and that by erasing the culture of a people, you erase a people. And also in the music world, we study this especially too in instances like the 19th century, where so much of Eastern Europe did not even appear on a map. at the time, because the idea was to erase the individual cultures of those people. But it also then caused a galvanization among those people to fight to preserve their culture, to publicize their culture, to fight for their literature, their music, their language, etc. So it's an interesting juxtaposition of suppression and censorship, but then also how suppression and censorship can galvanize the people being suppressed to fight harder to preserve their culture for the future and their cultural legacy. So I think with that, we're going to open up the floor to questions, which you can put in the chat. And yeah, so if anybody has any questions or comments that they would like to ask our speakers.
Karen, will we have any opportunity to also raise some questions?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good.
Yeah, feel free. Go ahead.
Okay, very, very good. I enjoyed, by the way, Oring and Vera's really insightful discussions here. I do have a couple of questions that I'd like to ask my colleagues as we really work at these difficult problems. So, Oring, I just wanted to get your opinion about a subject you know so much about, that you make that very compelling case of silencing the narratives among the Kurdish people. But I'm wondering what you would say about the Kurds themselves engaging in some of the activity that you were pointing out, specifically against Yazidi speech. What would you say about that, I guess is my question, whether or not that's a serious problem, I believe it is, and whether or not, therefore, the Kurds are not only themselves victims, but might themselves engage in some of the practices of suppressing speech. Can you comment on that, or at least tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Karen, is that okay if I comment straight away? All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Janice. I gladly would like to talk about that. Yazidis, I don't see them as, because Yazidis are also Kurdish people. We're all one nation. Everybody in Kurdistan who lives there, we are one. We live there. And each and every person who lives in Kurdistan has been through atrocities and human rights violations and genocides. And of course, unfortunately, the Yazidis as well, the Yazidi religion as well. Now, your question, if I understand, if within the Kurdish community, we have censorship about the Yazidis, specifically Yazidis, you're talking about a region where we have more religion than one can count in one or two hands. Yeah. So, of course, and you are in the Middle East, you have to imagine, I cannot speak for all Kurdish people, but what I can tell you is the fact that not only myself, but also the government, the Kurdish regional government, they're trying to promote one Kurdistan that everybody lives there. Yeah, the whole community. I cannot answer your question about one specific family hurting the other family, no. But in overall, the Kurdish community are very passionate about having the rights of the Yazidis, getting their own right, or either it's Yazidi or the Christians or the Kakis or anything. Yeah, that's what I'm. Now, again, I am aware of the fact that many people work for, unfortunately, militant groups. I am aware of that. We all know, because the minute, I am very happy you said that, because one part that I did not, otherwise my speech would be very, very long, is because of the fact, I'll give you an example. The Kurdish fighters, the Peshmergas, yeah, they were the U.S. actually everybody's biggest friend at the time, because they literally they freed Iraq for as far as it could be, it was possible, from ISIS, right? The first thing, with the help of UN and US, once the ISIS were there, who did they give Shingal to? to militants to protect it, to militants, not to Kurdish people, to militants. And I'm not sure that, Dr. Klein, if you know it, if you go now to Shingal, even Yazidi people do not want to go back there. They rather stay in the camps, having nothing, instead going back to their own home. So now I'm asking you a question. What is right there? Yeah. Because it's a censorship. We are taught to do like this. We are taught, look, as a Kurd, you do not have this. Okay, it's good. You've saved the area. You've done your best. Now you go. We'll take care of it. But what do? The Yazidi people don't have a house. They don't have a city where they can live in. They do not feel safe. So that's why they live in the camps. In a camp where you have only one room with 10 family members to stay at, but that's at least safe. It's safer. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Dennis.
Dennis, you're muted.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important response. Your research, by the way, in a part of the world that so few people know about is really important, and I wanted to emphasize that point. But I think, and I think we can end this part of the discussion here, at least as far as I'm concerned. But my own research about genocide, I believe there's a very strong current of polemics. We tend to take sides.
Yeah.
And as someone who likes to believe, I don't think I always practice what I preach, but I like to believe that we are stepping back a bit. And here I'll acknowledge, Vera, what you were saying and really correcting some of what I had said, that it's not a matter of just silencing a people, but it's establishing a narrative. And I think your point, word amplification of speech seems so counterintuitive, but is a compelling argument. And I think it's just an example of what we all need to do in trying to understand these difficult problems, is to step back a bit and to look at the complexity sometimes in our regions. And so, Oring, that is really what I was referring to before.
Thank you. You're absolutely right, Dennis. Thank you.
Yes, and we do have a question. If can the speakers talk about what they see as solutions to censorship by civil society?
Yes.
So I was going to say, if you want to each take a turn, or whoever wants to jump in, feel free. Go ahead, Auren.
All right, thank you. That's a wonderful question, actually, because here we are. We all have focused on the censorship, and what's the reality for us. Well, in my case, for Kurdish people, yes, we are a part of an indigenous group. We are an indigenous group. We all know that this world where we live in has many other indigenous groups. So I do think that what I'm saying right now applies for many other indigenous groups. As an indigenous group, just a simple example, we do not have a representation at the UN. So that means we do not have a voice at the United Nations, which is, if you look at it on the global, on the universal term, it's just not right. As a human, it's just not right how, those tables are turned. Yeah. So as a Kurd, I am always behind other nations who do have a voice at the UN. Not that, having a voice at the UN is the ultimate, no, but at least it's a protection of the international community, of the global community. Yeah. I think if we would push for a system, a global system, a universal system, where all the nations have a voice, to point out either it's human rights violation, either it's genocide or anything, and just leave the fact that, okay, we have economic business, or we have other interests with the other countries. So that's why we need to put what is right. We need to put human right on a higher scale. Yeah. Nowadays, what we see is the fact that human rights is seen as the last one, because first of all, we look at the political, in the political arena, we look at, like, how do the governments work? How do those countries have other interests together, right? But instead of that, look at the human rights issues. What is right? Literally what Dr. Klein said, but the point is, I truly do believe we have to go back to the basics of human rights. Go back. What does it need? What do we need to make sure that this world is equally safe for everybody, for all the nations?
Dennis or Vera, do you want to jump in on that? Go ahead,
Sure,
Vera.
I'll jump in. I think that civil society has always found creative ways of curtailing or just avoiding censorship by the government. I know that during Guatemala's armed conflict, they had underground presses, they had pirate radios, clandestine newsletters. And so, for example, La Voz Popular was a guerrilla movement newsletter that circulated news throughout the highlands, which is where most of the violence was taking place at the time. Also, indigenous community radio stations, even to this day, still broadcast in Mayan languages. And so that's how they resist erasure and reclaim the narrative space. They have realized from long ago that if they don't claim this, if they don't actively resist, they will be erased, because that is what the Guatemalan government has wanted for generations. But one of the most iconic solutions was Radio Venceremos from El Salvador, for the FMLN's rebel radio. And they were founded in 1981, also around this time. And I cover Central America, so I'm just going to go ahead and insert El Salvador here. And so, they were broadcasting from the mountains, and their stories, their histories is one of the most fascinating. They used to run around with their radio equipment from place to place, avoiding the government. They had several close calls, but they managed to resist, and they survived up till the peace accord agreement were signed in 1992. And so they had a very long run, and that's one of the ways that civil society has learned to resist censorship by the government. Just being creative. Sounds easy, I know.
Yeah, I was going to just add that under circumstances I would have under to power that is so hegemonic. So that would be a considerable concern. And yep, I think there's some heroic expression nonetheless. Let me just add to this that, and it's a very helpful one for us. But I was just focusing on social media. We know how difficult it is to control speech on social media, although there have been efforts, certainly in China, to do exactly that. So nonetheless, has been an attempt to control social media. But nonetheless, I think speech is a difficult thing to completely erase. I even go so far in this report to make the case that it's actually futile, that it doesn't really, especially in an age of social media, it seems to be very effective, but you never know. I mean, there are examples when controlling social media is considerable. So these are the questions I think we have to continue looking at.
Yeah.
If anyone else has any other questions, we do have about 3 minutes. If anybody wants to send anything over the Q&A. Here's a question. Can you talk about how the book in 1984 is relevant today in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, my own comment about that, it's a good question. There certainly has been a very important work. 1984 is a very good example of this, of acknowledging and documenting the extent to which even a so-called democratic government can use mechanisms to suppress, erase, or in other words, control the narrative. And I think it's a very effective work in acknowledging and pointing out exactly what the problem is. My only question, which is about a subject we're talking about at large, is just how effective a work like 1984 is. We know how popular it is, and we know how much has been discussed, but whether it has made a practical difference is a question I'll keep open for now, but that would be my question.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Or do our speakers, anybody else want to jump in here? Okay, well, it's pretty much right at 10 o'clock, so I think we're going to end this here. And I want to thank all of our speakers for their amazing presentations. This was such an incredible panel on a topic that is, incredibly relevant right now. So I want to thank you all for your time and thank everybody for joining us. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and week.
Thank you very much, Karen.
Yeah, thank you. This is very, very, very effective. Thank you.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Karen. Appreciate it.
I was very happy to do this.